So I got an email about a week ago from a woman in Brazil called Mayra Cavallo. And her words summed up the reason that Loomio exists more beautifully than anything that I could come up with. So I'd really like to share them with you now. She wrote, "We're in the middle of an interesting process in Brazil, as I'm sure that you're aware. We see a lot of energy, good energy, rising among the generation of young people in our country. But we still don't know exactly how to achieve this country that we dream of. Your software seems to be exactly what we need right now, an online tool for our digital natives who are waking up to their political power, to give us the space we need to transform our dreams into concrete action, to help us relearn how democracy is made through engaged discussion and informed participation." So how is it that a young person in Brazil, in the middle of this massive social movement involving more than 1 million people, is writing an email with such a powerful message to a bunch of young people in Wellington working on a pretty humble software project? Well, if you go back 6 weeks in Brazil, the government decides to raise the cost of public transport. The response is a series of small, non-violent protests. The police response to the protests is violent. So police are using tear gas, they fire rubber bullets into crowds of peaceful protesters, shooting at journalists. Within several days, these images are spread through citizen journalism and through social media, images of police violence. And again, social media is used to mobilize more than 1 million people. So more than 1 million people out on the streets in the last few weeks. So is this just happening in Brazil? If you go back 2 more weeks in Turkey, so the government announces plans to bulldoze one of the last remaining green areas in the middle of Istanbul. A group of environmentalists stage a small, peaceful protest. The police respond with violence, shooting tear gas into crowds of protesters. Again, these images are captured by citizen journalists, and they're spread through social media. And within days, the response, hundreds of thousands of people in Turkey mobilized and out in the streets. So how is this happening? And if you go back another 2.5 years, you go back to 2010, 2011, starting in Tunisia, huge mobilization of people against an oppressive regime, again using the tools of social media to get out on the streets in a very short space of time, leads to the downfall of the dictatorship. Then this sweeps through to Egypt, people rising up against Mubarak's oppressive regime, ends with Mubarak stepping down. So then you have this movement sweeping through Latin America and through Spain and through other parts of Europe. The Indignados movement, again, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Then midway through 2011, in New York, you have a group of peaceful protesters occupying a park in Wall Street. So the Occupy movement sweeps around the world to every continent, 3,000 cities, right through Asia, through Africa, through Europe, and even to Australasia. So what have we learned from this? So these movements, they're adapted to local circumstances, but they have some key characteristics, some emergent characteristics in common. So these movements have been explicitly non-violent in large part, even in the face of quite horrific police violence. They've been organized democratically. So these are grassroots, horizontally organized movements. There's been a heavy use of social media and online technology, both for documenting police violence and for mobilizing large numbers of people. And they're explicitly transformative rather than revolutionary. So there's a real focus on systems and institutions rather than this sort of traditional revolutionary idea of taking power from a small number of people and giving it to another small number of people. So overall, you've got this situation where millions, tens of millions of people have mobilized in the last 3 years with a global call for more participation in decision-making at every level. So the takeaway from all this is that it's really clear that the internet, and social media in particular, are extremely powerful tools for mobilizing huge numbers of people in a really short space of time. Mobilizing people to stand up and say no to oppressive governments, to oppressive regimes. So the question is now, what happens after the protests have died down? What happens when the governments have stepped down or the government have made concessions? How do you take that huge source of mobilized energy and translate it into sustained collective action to build viable alternatives, viable community-driven, democratically decided alternatives? And so this is a challenge. It's a huge challenge, and it's a challenge being addressed by people all over the world, even in Wellington. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some people in Wellington are doing to tackle a tiny part of this challenge. So if we skip back to October 15th, 2011, there's a global day of action in solidarity with the Occupy Wall Street movement. This, again, sweeps through lots of countries, ends up in New Zealand. Just outside this building, several hundred people gather in Civic Square. There's no central coordination. There's no leader. There's no organization telling everyone what to do. There's just a bunch of concerned people who feel that it's time for this global conversation to start. And so what you see over the next few hours is people have these spontaneous conversations. So really getting to the core of what they're concerned about at a systemic institutional level. So conversations about climate change, ecosystem collapse, global economic inequality, resource depletion, and starting this public conversation about what can be done about these massive systemic problems. And so people stayed. Some people decided to stay the night. The first decision that the group made together was that decisions would be made collectively. Decisions would be made in a General Assembly format, so a public meeting where agreement is expressed visually by hand signals, so up for agreement and down for disagreement. And through this process, through this organic organizing, self-organizing process, you have people breaking up into subgroups and then sub-subgroups. So after a day, you've got a kitchen that's feeding 70 people a day. You've got a hospitality crew that's greeting people day and night. You've got a comms team that's sending out press releases and getting in contact with movements in the rest of the world. And like many people involved, this was my first experience of collective decision-making on a really large scale. So when it goes well, when a General Assembly is really well run, it can be one of the most sort of empowering experiences of your life. So you've got this situation where, there are 100 people, in other places, thousands of people getting together. Everyone's got a chance to speak. Every voice is heard, and no one's alienated from the decision-making process. And you get this real effect of collective wisdom, where the group ends up making decisions that are better than any individual would have come up with on their own. But the flip side of it, the dark side of collective decision-making, is when it's badly facilitated or the process falls apart. You're in meetings for 5 hours, just banging your head against the wall, nothing's decided, and everyone walks away unhappy. You've got a situation where only one person can speak at a time, and loud voices tend to dominate the conversation, dominate the discussion, and have an undue influence over the decisions that are made. So we're sitting there grappling with this dilemma, having seen the empowering upside of collective decision-making and the extremely disempowering downside of it when these practical constraints get in the way. So we're sitting around thinking, well, if only there was some kind of communications technology that we could use to overcome these constraints of geography and time and bandwidth of communication or volume of voice. And, well, it turns out there is, and it's called the internet. So it seems blindingly obvious now, but at the time it felt like a revelation. Just shifting this simple collective decision-making process online, all of a sudden, we're sitting there thinking, well, this opens up huge possibilities. we're getting these visions of collective decision-making distributed on a global scale. So workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, boards of trustees. As soon as you put something online, the global possibilities are endless. And so that led us down this track of thinking, well, what if we could use this technology to break down this old trade-off between making good decisions, so decisions where no one's excluded from the outcome, and making fast decisions, really getting things done efficiently. What if we could, bring down the cost of participating in decision-making so much that it just becomes the status quo, the regular way of doing things? What if the old excuse that a rigid top-down chain of command is the only efficient way of getting things done, what if that excuse was no longer relevant? So just at this time that we're buzzing on this vision, we found out about a social enterprise network in Wellington called Enspiral. So Enspiral is a network of tech-focused, socially minded businesses, so each with a core social or environmental mission. And these are companies with a difference. So they're not profit-maximizing companies. The main goal is to maximize positive social impact. And they use the tools of business to get there. So it was clear straight away that people at Enspiral were using the totally different tools, but to get to the same place that we were headed. And when we sat down with them and started talking about this idea of shifting collective decision-making online, they said, well, we need that too. We need that to make decisions about our business. We need that to collaboratively write documents together and agree employment contracts. So we struck up this partnership. We started working together to build this thing. Over the next 12 months, a team formed around the idea. People, community leaders, business people, other web developers, and this project became known as Loomio. And so the starting point was to build a simple-to-use, straightforward platform that provides a neutral space for groups to come together, have discussions, and make clear decisions together. So this is what it looks like. So the core components are really simple, and if they weren't, we wouldn't be doing our job right. So you've got a discussion, the group discusses a topic. Within a discussion, so anyone can make a proposal, and on a proposal, anyone can have a say just by clicking one button. So when someone puts up a proposal, you can agree with it, say you want it to go ahead. You can abstain and say you need a bit more information, or you're happy for the group to decide without you. You can disagree and say, well, I think we could probably come up with a better idea. Or you can block, and you can say, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. I'll be seriously disadvantaged if this goes ahead. And so people can change their position at any time in the system. So what you get is this dynamic, flexible framework where, as concerns are raised in the discussion, they can be teased out and they can be addressed, and you can resolve concerns, leading to this shared understanding and this agreement. And through this sort of flexible process, you unlock this collective wisdom of groups, where through modifying a proposal to address concerns, going through these iterations, you end up with a group making much better decisions than any individual would have by themselves. So where we're at right now is, we've got a user-friendly tool that's being used by 1,700 groups around the world. We've formed a cooperative social enterprise to steward the project. It's an open source initiative, so anyone can contribute to the code wherever they happen to be. It's beginning to be translated into multiple languages. So as of last week, it's translated into Spanish and into Greek, with 6 other languages underway. And as of this morning, people are starting to translate it into Vietnamese and Hungarian. So there are, as of this morning, there are 5,950 signed up users of Loomio in about 20 different countries. And the diversity of organizations and groups using Loomio is one of the most striking things about it. So, right now in India, people are using Loomio to organize an international summit on nonviolent communication. At the same time, in San Francisco, there's an organic grocery cooperative using it to organize their business, to make collective decisions about their business. Right here in Wellington, Wellington City Council used Loomio over the last few months for a large-scale public consultation and collaboration. And the list of use cases is almost endless, and I get totally addicted to reading the list of requests from groups that are applying to use it. So it's being used by software companies in France, it's being used by schools, it's being used by libraries, it's being used to organize conferences and festivals. So this vision that we were having during Occupy of this sort of distributed, decentralized, networked neighborhood decision-making all of a sudden doesn't seem quite so unrealistic. And we're at the very beginnings of this. And Loomio is only going to play a small part in this general trend, this trend towards networked systems being able to compete with traditional hierarchical systems. So this is a visualization of the internet. So people are more connected globally than ever before in human history. So this telecommunications framework, it's increasingly complex, it's exponentially connected, and this gives the potential, this infrastructure lays the foundations for collaboration and innovation on a scale that we've never seen before. But this isn't inevitable. So all of this rests on the internet being held as a public resource, a commonly held resource. And there are very real threats to that. So whether it's government surveillance or overzealous copyright legislation, there are very real threats to the internet as a publicly held resource in the common good. So when we've got a generation of young people growing up with the understanding that to make a good decision, you need to involve the people who are affected by it. And growing up with the understanding that when there's a decision being made that affects you, you can and should have an opportunity to participate in it, that's when the internet will have really delivered on its true potential. Thank you very much.